The stars shone like diamonds against the void of space as the Luminara's distress beacon pulsed its desperate message across the galaxy. Their world, a beautiful blue-green jewel much like Earth, burned. The Shadowkin warships hung in orbit like dark clouds, their weapons systematically destroying everything the peaceful Luminara had built over thousands of years. In the Galactic Council's Grand Chamber, the Luminara representative's hologram flickered weakly. His light-based form, usually bright and steady, wavered with fear. "Please," he begged, his voice trembling. "They are killing our children. Our cities burn. We have never harmed anyone. Why won't you help us?" The 12 council members, each representing the most advanced species in known space, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Their massive chamber, with its ornate decorations showing 10,000 years of galactic peace, had never felt so cold. The head counselor, a tall being made of crystalline structures, spoke with calculated precision. "The peace protocols are clear. Military intervention would destabilize the careful balance we have maintained. We cannot risk another galactic war. We offer our deepest sympathies." In that moment, a new signal cut through the chamber's communications. The council members turned as one, some showing visible disgust at the rough, untamed energy signature. It was Earth's representative, the newest and most controversial addition to galactic society. Captain James Walker of the Earth Defense Force stood straight in his blue uniform, his weathered face set in grim determination. His hologram might not have been as sophisticated as the others, but his presence filled the chamber. "You're telling me," he said slowly, his voice carrying that unique human intensity that made other species uncomfortable, "that we're going to sit here and watch genocide happen?" Captain Walker, the head counselor's voice carried a note of warning. "Humanity has only recently joined galactic society. You don't understand the delicate nature of." "We understand perfectly," Walker cut in, causing several council members to flinch at the breach of protocol. "We understand what it means to watch civilization burn. We understand what happens when good people do nothing." The Luminara representative's light pulsed hopefully, but the council remained unmoved. One member, a being of pure energy, spoke up. "Humans are too emotional, too prone to violence. Your species still fights among themselves. You cannot comprehend the complex calculations that go into maintaining galactic peace." Walker's laugh was harsh, empty of humor. "Complex calculations. While children die. Maybe we are violent. Maybe we are emotional. But right now, those seem like better qualities than whatever you're showing." He turned to the Luminara representative. "How many can still be saved?" "Millions." The Luminara's light brightened slightly. "If we can evacuate our shelter cities. But the Shadowkin blockade." "Send us the coordinates." Walker's voice was steel. "Send us everything you know about their defenses." The head counselor rose, crystal form gleaming. "Captain Walker, if Earth intervenes, it will be seen as an act of aggression. You will face sanctions. Your species' membership in the council will be reconsidered." Walker looked at each council member in turn, his human eyes carrying something the others couldn't quite understand. A fire that burned with both rage and compassion. "Then reconsider it. But while you sit in this pretty chamber talking about protocols, I'm going to gather every ship and every soldier willing to fight. Because that's what humans do. We get angry. We break protocols. And we don't watch children die." The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving the council chamber in stunned silence. The Luminara representative's hologram glowed brighter than it had in days, hope returning to its ethereal form. In Earth's orbit, Captain Walker was already sending out the call. Humanity had been called many things since joining galactic society. Aggressive, emotional, primitive, dangerous. Now they would show the galaxy exactly what those qualities meant when turned toward protecting the innocent. The rescue fleet was about to prove that sometimes, being too angry to accept injustice was exactly what the galaxy needed. The news spread across Earth like wildfire. Within hours of Captain Walker's call, thousands of ships were preparing for launch. Military vessels, civilian cargo ships, even old mining craft. Anything that could fly and carry passengers was being readied. In the command center of the Earth Defense Force, Walker stood before a room full of volunteers. The giant screen behind him showed images of burning Luminara cities, their beautiful crystal structures melting under Shadowkin weapons. The room was dead quiet except for his voice. "I won't lie to you," he said, his hands gripping the podium. "This is against council law. If you come with me, you might lose everything. Your ranks, your citizenship rights, maybe even your lives." He paused, looking at the sea of determined faces. "But there are millions of innocent beings out there waiting for help that isn't coming. Not unless we do something about it." Lieutenant Anna Reed sat in the front row, her rescue specialist badge gleaming on her chest. She had seen her share of disasters on Earth: earthquakes, floods, wars. But this was different. This was bigger than anything humanity had faced before. Her hand was the first to rise when Walker asked for volunteers. "Sir," she stood up, her voice clear and strong. "The Council calls us primitive because we still run into burning buildings to save strangers. They call us emotional because we can't stand by and watch suffering." A small smile crossed her face. "I say we show them exactly what primitive, emotional humans can do." The room erupted in cheers. Walker nodded, a fierce pride burning in his chest. This was humanity at its finest. Not the peaceful, logical utopia the Council wanted, but something perhaps more valuable. People willing to risk everything to help others. In orbit, ships were already gathering. The Earth Defense Force's sleek warships formed the core of the fleet, but they were joined by vessels of all shapes and sizes. Hospital ships staffed by doctors who didn't hesitate when they heard about dying children. Construction vessels whose crews knew how to work in dangerous conditions. Even old rescue workers who had spent their lives pulling people from rubble. The Council's warnings came in constantly, each one more dire than the last. They threatened economic sanctions, political isolation, even military action. The human leaders debated for hours, weighing the costs against their consciences. In the end, Earth's response to the Council was simple. We remember our own history. We remember when we faced extinction. We remember what it meant to stand alone. We will not abandon others to that fate. Walker walked through the corridors of his command ship, checking preparations. Every crew member he passed was busy, focused, determined. They weren't the polished, perfect soldiers the Council preferred. They were human, messy, emotional, and unstoppable when they believed in something. "Fleet status report," he called out as he entered the bridge. Lieutenant Reed looked up from her station. 47 warships, 83 rescue vessels, over 200 civilian ships converted for evacuation. All crews report ready. She hesitated. "Sir, the Council just sent another warning. They say we're proving why humans aren't ready for galactic society." Walker took his command chair, looking at the massive fleet gathered around his ship. Each vessel represented people who chose to risk everything to save strangers of another species. People the Council called too aggressive, too emotional, too primitive. "Send a message to all ships," he said, his voice firm. "The Council thinks we're not ready for their society because we're too human. But right now, the Luminara don't need a society that watches them die. They need humans with all our flaws and all our strength. Let's show the galaxy what that means." The fleet move is one, breaking orbit and heading toward the coordinates the Luminara had sent. Behind them, Earth's sun shone bright and steady, like hope in the darkness of space. The human fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Luminara system. The sight that greeted them made even the most hardened veterans catch their breath. Hundreds of Shadowkin warships formed a dark wall around the inner planets, their black hulls absorbing nearby starlight. "They've never faced humans before," Walker said from his command chair, studying the enemy fleet. "They expect everyone to fight like the Council races, all proper rules and careful planning." A grim smile crossed his face. "Let's show them something new." Lieutenant Reed's voice carried across the bridge. "Sir, the Shadowkin are broadcasting. They're demanding we leave the system or be destroyed." "Good." Walker stood up. "That means they're watching us. Time to give them a show. Launch Operation Trojan." What happened next would be talked about in the council chambers for years to come. The human fleet split apart in what looked like complete chaos. Mining ships charged forward, their heavy armor gleaming. Behind them, cargo vessels started dumping their holds, releasing clouds of metal debris and old satellites into space. The Shadowkin commanders watched in confusion. Their tactical computers, programmed for proper space warfare, couldn't make sense of what they were seeing. When they fired their weapons, most shots hit worthless debris or empty mining ships. "Now for the real surprise," Walker said quietly. "Lieutenant Reed, signal the stealth teams." While the Shadowkin were distracted by the apparent madness at the front of the fleet, smaller human ships had been sliding through the debris field. They were rescue ships and medical vessels, painted black and running silent. The Shadowkin, so focused on the noisy distraction ahead, never saw them coming. The first explosion caught everyone by surprise. One of the mining ships, now empty of its crew who had secretly transferred to other vessels, rammed straight into a Shadowkin battleship. The impact wasn't enough to destroy the massive vessel, but it cracked its armor, something the Shadowkin had thought impossible. "Humans," one of the bridge crew said with pride, "invented ramming speed." The Shadowkin fleet started to respond, but they were fighting shadows. Every time they turned to face one threat, another appeared. Human ships used tactics that the Council had labeled as primitive centuries ago. Playing dead, using debris as cover, even letting smaller ships be towed behind larger ones to hide their engine signatures. "Sir," Reed's voice was excited. "The rescue ships report successful penetration of the blockade. They're heading for the planet now." Walker nodded, watching as another mining ship slammed into a Shadowkin vessel. "Send the second wave. And broadcast this on all frequencies. Let the Council see what happens when you corner humans." The Shadowkin commanders were facing something their tactical computers said was impossible. Their efficient, orderly blockade was being torn apart by what looked like complete chaos. Human ships ignored damage that should have stopped them, kept fighting when retreat was the logical choice, and used tactics that no self-respecting space navy would consider. "They're breaking formation," Reed reported, grinning. "The Shadowkin fleet is splitting up, trying to chase down individual ships, just like you said they would, sir." "Of course they are." Walker watched as gaps appeared in the once solid blockade. "They think we're being irrational, emotional, primitive. They don't understand that's exactly what we want them to think." Through these gaps, more rescue ships slipped through, racing toward the burning Luminara cities below. The Council's observers, watching from a safe distance, saw something that challenged everything they thought they knew about warfare. The supposedly primitive humans had taken what the Council saw as flaws, their unpredictability, their willingness to sacrifice, their irrational behavior, and turned them into strengths. The path to the planet was open. Phase 1 of humanity's rescue mission was complete, but the hardest part was still to come. On the surface of the Luminara homeworld, millions waited for help. Help that, thanks to humanity's primitive tactics, was finally on its way. Lieutenant Anna Reed stood at the door of her rescue shuttle as it descended through the burning atmosphere of the Luminara homeworld. The planet below was beautiful even in its devastation. Crystal cities stretched toward the sky, now cracked and smoking from Shadowkin attacks. "Remember," she spoke to her team of rescue workers, "the Luminara are light-based beings. They can pass through solid objects, but they need their containment suits to survive long-distance travel. Our job is to get them to the evacuation ships with their suits intact." The shuttle shook as it broke through the clouds. The view below made Reed's heart stop for a moment. A vast crystal city sprawled beneath them, its towers glowing with trapped Luminara citizens. Shadowkin ground forces patrolled the streets, their dark armor a stark contrast to the shimmering buildings. "This is why they call us primitive," Reed said, checking her rescue gear. "Because we're about to do something no civilized species would consider. We're going to run straight into danger to save strangers." The shuttle landed in a hidden courtyard, and Reed's team moved out immediately. They had trained for earthquakes, floods, and war zones on Earth, but this was different. The air was thick with smoke, and the crystal buildings sang a haunting melody as they cracked in the heat. Inside the first building, they found hundreds of Luminara huddled together, their light dim with fear. When they saw the humans charging in with rescue gear, their glow flickered in confusion. "Why do you help us?" one asked, its voice like wind chimes. "The council said no one would come." Reed smiled as she helped attach a portable containment suit to the speaker. "Because on Earth, we have a saying. The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. And we're not going to do nothing." Across the city, other human rescue teams were doing the same. They ran into burning buildings, fought through Shadowkin patrols, and carried Luminara children to safety. The Council's observers watched in disbelief as humans ignored their own injuries, used primitive paper maps when electronics failed, and kept going back for more survivors, even when logic said they should retreat. "Sir," Reed called over her radio to Walker in orbit, "we've got a problem. The Shadowkin are targeting the evacuation routes. We need a distraction." Walker's voice crackled back. "The Council would say it's suicide to engage the Shadowkin ground forces directly. Good thing we're not the Council. Stand by." Minutes later, the ground shook as human ships began low-altitude runs over the city. They weren't firing weapons. They were playing music. Earth music, blasted at full volume. Songs of defiance and hope that echoed through the crystal towers. The Shadowkin, their sensors overwhelmed by the cacophony, began firing wildly at the sky. "Now," Reed ordered, and her teams moved. They led lines of Luminara through the chaos, using the confusion to reach the evacuation ships. The Luminara, who had never seen anything like it, watched in awe as humans sang along with the music while carrying their children to safety. "Your species is so strange," one Luminara elder said to Reed as she helped them aboard a ship. "You run into danger instead of away from it. You use noise as a weapon. You laugh in the face of death." Reed secured the elder's containment suit and smiled. "That's because we learned something important back on Earth. Sometimes being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared but doing what's right anyway." Above them, the music continued to play as more rescue ships landed. The Shadowkin, for the first time in their history, found themselves facing an enemy they couldn't understand. Creatures who would risk everything not for profit or power, but simply because it was right. And in orbit, Captain Walker watched the rescue members climb. The Council had called humans primitive for still having emotions like anger and fear. But they were about to learn that humans also had other, more powerful emotions, like compassion, courage, and an unshakable determination to help those in need. The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council erupted into chaos as the latest footage from the Luminara homeworld played on the massive screens. The crystal-formed head counselor stood frozen, watching humans charge into burning buildings and emerge carrying Luminara children to safety. "This is unacceptable." The head counselor's voice shook with barely controlled anger. "They are breaking every protocol we have established over 10,000 years of peace. We must stop them immediately." But for the first time in council history, not everyone agreed. A younger council member, representing a species that had nearly faced extinction themselves centuries ago, stood up. "Stop them from what? From saving innocent lives while we sit here and debate." In orbit around the Luminara homeworld, Captain Walker received the Council's transmission ordering an immediate withdrawal. Instead of responding, he opened a channel to every ship in the galaxy capable of receiving the signal. "To all species watching," he said, his voice steady, "I want you to see what the Shadowkin have been doing while the Council looked away." The broadcast showed everything. Cities burning, children crying, the systematic destruction of a peaceful civilization. But it also showed something else. Humans, those primitive newcomers to galactic society, fighting back against impossible odds. Not with superior technology or overwhelming force, but with courage, determination, and an unwavering refusal to abandon those in need. Lieutenant Reed's voice came over the command channel. "Sir, you need to see this." She sent in footage from the ground. The Shadowkin were retreating from several sectors, but not because of human attacks. Other ships were arriving. Volunteers from younger species who had watched the human broadcast and decided to follow their example. "The Council calls us emotional," Walker broadcast again. "They say we're too aggressive, too primitive to understand galactic peace. But I ask you, what good is peace if it means watching genocide happen? What good is civilization if it means turning away from those who need help?" In the council chamber, more members began to speak up. The footage continued to play. Humans using mining tools to break through Shadowkin barriers, rescue workers singing Earth songs to calm scared Luminara children, medical teams working until they collapsed to save lives. Perhaps, one council member said slowly, "We have confused peace with inaction. And perhaps we have mistaken humanity's passion for primitiveness." The head counselor tried one last time. "If we break the protocols now, everything we've built could collapse. If we don't break them," another member responded, "we don't deserve what we've built." Back on the planet's surface, Reed and her team watched in amazement as ships from a dozen different species began landing around them. The newcomers were awkward, uncertain, clearly unused to direct action. But they were there. "We saw your broadcast," one of them told Reed. "We saw humans risking everything to save strangers. You showed us that sometimes rules must be broken to do what's right." In orbit, Walker received a new message from the Council. But this time, it wasn't a warning. It was a formal declaration acknowledging humanity's actions as legitimate under a long-forgotten clause in galactic law: the right to defend civilizations facing extinction. "It's not enough," Walker told his crew, "but it's a start. Send word to all ships. The evacuation continues. And send a message to Earth. Tell them that humanity's greatest flaws just changed the galaxy." The Shadowkin forces, faced with growing resistance from multiple species, began to pull back. They had built their power on the assumption that no one would dare to stand against them. They hadn't counted on humanity showing the rest of the galaxy how to be brave. As the sun rose over the crystal cities, ships from more and more species arrived. The humans had done more than just save the Luminara. They had reminded the galaxy that true civilization isn't about maintaining perfect order. It's about having the courage to fight for what's right. The Shadowkin's Supreme Commander watched his tactical display with growing fear, an emotion his species had long forgotten how to handle. His forces were facing something unprecedented. An enemy that refused to follow predictions, backed by a growing coalition of species that were suddenly finding their courage. "Launch the final attack," he ordered. "Target the evacuation ships. Show them what happens to those who resist us." On the bridge of his command ship, Captain Walker received the warning too late. Hundreds of Shadowkin vessels emerged from hidden positions, all targeting the civilian ships loaded with Luminara refugees. The attack was designed to break the human spirit by forcing them to watch helplessly as innocent lives were lost. Instead, it showed the galaxy exactly what humans were made of. "All military vessels, form a defensive line," Walker commanded, his voice hard as steel. "Every civilian ship that can fight with us. Everyone else, full speed to the safe zone." He paused for one moment. "This is what humans do. We stand between the monsters and the innocent, no matter the cost." Lieutenant Reed's voice crackled over the comm from the planet's surface. "Sir, we've still got thousands of Luminara in the ground evacuation zones. We need more time." "Then we'll give you more time," Walker replied. He opened a channel to all ships. "This is what the Council calls human aggression. This is what they fear about us. Our unwillingness to surrender when lives are at stake. Our refusal to accept defeat. Our primitive, emotional, Human nature that makes us stand and fight when logic says to run. Show them what that means. The human fleet moved as one, forming a wall of ships between the Shadowkin and their targets. Cargo ships flew beside warships. Mining vessels turned their industrial cutting beams into weapons. Medical ships used their advanced scanners to detect weak points in Shadowkin armor. The Shadowkin attack hit like a hammer, but the human line held. Ships exploded, crews died, but no one broke formation. For every human vessel destroyed, 2 more moved to fill the gap. "Sir," Reed's voice came again. "The Shadowkin ground forces are charging the evacuation zones. We need support." Walker looked at his tactical display. He couldn't spare any ships from the space battle. But then he saw something that made him smile. Vessels from other species were diving into the atmosphere, finally following humanity's example. "You've got help coming, Lieutenant," he said. "The galaxy is waking up." The Shadowkin commanders watched in growing panic as their perfect tactical computers failed them again and again. Humans used strategies that made no logical sense, sacrificing powerful ships to save weaker ones, using civilian vessels as bait, deliberately taking damage to create opportunities for others. But worse, from the Shadowkin perspective, was that others were learning from them. Young species that had always bowed to Shadowkin pressure were now fighting back, using human tactics that ignored the proper rules of warfare. "Status report," Walker demanded, his bridge sparking with damaged systems. "Evacuation is 70% complete," his officer reported. "But sir, we're losing too many ships. We can't hold much longer." Walker stood up from his command chair, watching the battle rage around them. "We don't need to hold forever. We just need to hold long enough." He opened a channel to all frequencies. "To every human ship, remember Earth. Remember our history. Remember every time we faced extinction and survived. Remember why we fight. Not for glory, not for power, but for those who cannot fight for themselves. Hold the line." The human fleet fought on, their determination becoming a legend that would be told across the galaxy for generations. They were about to prove that sometimes the most primitive emotional response, standing your ground against impossible odds, was exactly what the universe needed. The final hours of the battle would be remembered for centuries to come. The human defensive line, battered but unbroken, continued to protect the evacuation ships. Behind them, the last groups of Luminara refugees were reaching safety, their light bodies glowing with hope instead of fear. Lieutenant Reed stood in the ruins of a crystal city, watching the last transport ship load up. A young Luminara child floated near her, its light pulsing with curiosity. "Why did you come?" the child asked, when no one else would. Reed knelt down to meet the child's glow at eye level. "Because a long time ago, humans learned something important. We learned that being called primitive for helping others is better than being called civilized for looking away." In space, the Shadowkin fleet was facing a truth they had never encountered before. Their tactical computers, programmed to predict logical responses, couldn't handle human unpredictability. But worse, they couldn't handle the way other species were beginning to act like humans. "Sir," a bridge officer called to Walker, "the Shadowkin flagship is hailing us." The Shadowkin Supreme Commander's dark form appeared on the screen. "You fight without logic," he said, his voice filled with confusion. "You sacrifice your ships to save others. You ignore tactical advantage to protect the weak. How can you expect to win?" Walker stood tall, his uniform scorched but his spirit unbroken. "That's what you never understood. We're not fighting to win. We're fighting because it's right. And that's why you've already lost." As if to prove his words, a new fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel. Ships from dozens of species, many of whom had never defied the Council before, arrived in formation. They had watched the humans fight, seen their courage, and finally found their own. The Shadowkin fleet, facing opposition from multiple directions, began to retreat. Their power had always relied on others being too afraid or too civilized to fight back. They had never planned for someone to show the galaxy how to be brave. In the council chamber, the head counselor watched the final moments of the battle. Perhaps, they said slowly, we have been wrong about humans. What we saw as primitive emotion, they turned into strength. What we called aggressive, they used to protect. The Luminara representatives' light glowed brighter than ever. They taught us all something important. Sometimes peace must be fought for. Sometimes rules must be broken to do what is right. Sometimes, the most civilized action is to be a little primitive. Back on the battlefield, Walker received the final evacuation numbers. Over 3 million Luminara had been saved. The cost had been high. Dozens of human ships destroyed. Hundreds of brave crew members lost. But they had shown the galaxy something it desperately needed to see. Reed joined Walker on the bridge of his ship, her rescue uniform still covered in crystal dust. The Luminara are asking what they can do to repay us, she said. Walker looked out at the stars, where ships from former council races were helping repair damaged human vessels. Tell them to remember. Remember that when the civilized races looked away, it was the angry, primitive humans who came. Remember that sometimes the most important thing isn't following rules, it's following your heart. The story spread quickly across the galaxy. How the humans, those emotional, aggressive newcomers, had risked everything to save strangers. How their primitive courage had inspired others to find their own bravery. How they had proven that being civilized wasn't about being perfect, it was about being willing to fight for what was right. In the end, the Shadowkin retreated to their own territories, their power broken not by superior force, but by the one thing they couldn't understand, the human spirit that refused to abandon those in need. And in the council chamber, a new law was written. It stated that sometimes peace required action, that rules should never outweigh right, and that perhaps the galaxy needed a little more of humanity's primitive courage after all.